She was the kind of woman people looked through, not at. Tessa Howe had spent 4 years perfecting the art of disappearing inside a room full of people. She wore dark colors. She kept her voice low. She never sat at the head of any table and never stayed late enough to be noticed. She was the payroll accountant for Meridian Holdings, a logistics and shipping firm with 17 warehouses along the eastern seaboard and one very quiet floor on the 14th level of a glass tower in downtown Chicago that nobody talked about and that Tessa had long since stopped asking questions about. She was good at her job. Excellent, actually. Numbers didn't lie to her the way people did. A misrouted wire transfer told a story. A zero that shouldn't exist screamed if you knew how to listen. Tessa knew how to listen. She also knew exactly who Meridian Holdings really was. She had figured it out in her 3rd week, when a shipment manifest crossed her desk with a weight discrepancy that couldn't be explained by any legitimate cargo. She had corrected the books, flagged nothing, and gone home that night, and stood over her kitchen sink for a long time with the tap running. She hadn't quit. She had told herself it was because she needed the money. Her mother's medical bills, her student loans. The apartment that cost too much because it was close enough to the hospital to matter. All of that was true, but somewhere underneath the practical reasons was a smaller, quieter truth she didn't look at directly. She was good at being invisible. And in a world that had spent most of her life treating her like furniture, too large, too plain, too much of everything that wasn't wanted, invisible felt safe. The man who owned Meridian Holdings was named Cassian More. Tessa had seen him exactly 3 times in 4 years. Once in the lobby, flanked by men in suits that cost more than her monthly rent. Once through the glass wall of the 14th floor conference room, standing at the head of a table, with his hands clasped behind his back, and something in his expression that made every other person in that room sit very still. And once, purely by accident, in the elevator. That last one she tried not to think about. He was 41, according to the public record. Born in Lyon, raised between Paris and New York, educated at Sciences Po, before disappearing from any traceable biography for nearly a decade. What he had been doing during those missing years was the subject of considerable speculation on the internet and absolute silence inside Meridian's walls. What Tessa knew, because numbers always told the truth, was that Cassian More was the most dangerous man in the Midwest, possibly the eastern half of the country. What she hadn't expected was for him to notice her. It started on a Tuesday in March, which Tessa would later think was an unremarkable day to have her life redirected by violence. She had stayed late to reconcile a quarterly discrepancy. A small one, $3,800, misattributed across 3 shell accounts in a way that was probably intentional, but that she corrected anyway because the error offended her. And by the time she was shutting down her computer, the office had been empty for 2 hours. The cleaning crew had already come and gone. The lights were on their automated evening dim. Tessa was pulling on her coat when she heard the elevator open on the other end of the floor. And she didn't think anything of it because people worked late in this building. She thought something of it when 3 men walked past the glass partition toward her desk with the particular kind of deliberate quiet that meant they already knew exactly where they were going. Tessa didn't move. She stood with one arm in her coat and watched them come, and she felt her mind do the thing it always did in moments like this, go very still and very clear, the way the surface of water goes flat before a storm. Tessa Howe, the one in front said. He wasn't asking. She recognized him. His name was Garrett Lund. He ran the Western distribution arm of Meridian's legitimate operations, which meant he ran the money laundering that fed through it. Tessa had spent 6 months quietly fixing the accounting errors his operation generated, and had never once met the man face to face. "Mr. Lund," she said, in the voice she used for everything, calm, a little flat, giving nothing away. "You've been accessing accounts outside your clearance," he said. We need to talk about that. Tessa had never accessed anything outside her clearance. She had simply been very good at her job, which meant she could see the shapes of things that were deliberately obscured, the way you could see a face hidden in a painting if you knew how to look. She hadn't touched anything she wasn't supposed to touch. She had only understood it. She opened her mouth to say something reasonable and measured, and then the man on Lund's right took a step forward, and she understood that this was not actually a conversation. She had time to think. I should have quit 3.5 years ago before the lights went out. She woke up in the back of a moving vehicle. Her wrists were zip-tied. Her head ached with the specific deep throb of someone who had been hit, rather than someone who had simply fallen, and her left cheekbone felt swollen and tight, which meant she had also connected with something on the way down. The floor beneath her was carpeted. The vehicle was expensive. She could tell by the way it moved. Smooth, cushioned, no rattle. She breathed through her nose. She took stock of what she knew. She was alive, which meant they wanted information first. Her phone was gone. Her shoes were still on, which she filed away as useful for reasons she hadn't determined yet. The two men in the vehicle with her were not the same ones from the office. These were younger, quieter, and they weren't looking at her, which meant they were either confident she wasn't a threat, or they had been told not to interact. Neither possibility was particularly comforting. The vehicle stopped after what felt like 40 minutes. She was walked, not dragged, which she also filed away, through a side entrance into what appeared to be a commercial storage facility. Cold concrete, high ceilings, the smell of salt and rust and something chemical underneath. They put her in a chair. They didn't tie her to it, which she thought was an interesting choice. But then she looked at the room and understood. There was one door and 4 men between her and it, and the room itself was the restraint. Lund came in 10 minutes later. He sat across from her with the relaxed posture of a man who believed this to already be over, and he slid a tablet across the table with a file open on the screen. "Walk me through the Hartwell accounts," he said. Tessa looked at the file. She looked at him. Those accounts are clean. They were until someone rerouted the audit trail to point back to a holding company registered in Delaware that doesn't exist anymore. That wasn't me. Your access codes were used. She felt something shift behind her ribs. Not panic, not yet, but the sharp, cold precursor to it. Someone had used her access codes. Someone inside the building had used her credentials to do something to accounts she managed, and now she was sitting in a warehouse with a zip tie mark on her wrists and a bruise forming along her cheekbone. "Mr. Lund," she said carefully, "if my codes were used, someone used them. That's not the same as me using them. Convenient distinction. It's an accurate one." He leaned back. He wasn't convinced, or he was convinced but didn't care, which was actually worse. "You've had access to the Meridian internal network for 4 years, Ms. Howe. You're very good with numbers. Suspiciously good. Some people think, that's why you hired me. That's why someone hired you." He paused, and something flickered in his expression, something that wasn't anger but was adjacent to it. Someone who no longer makes those decisions. Tessa was quiet. She was putting things together very quickly and not liking what they assembled into. "Where is the money?" Lund asked. "I don't know what money you're talking about." The man to her left moved, and she didn't quite manage to not flinch, and she hated herself for that, for the small animal instinct of it, the way her body betrayed her composure. But nothing happened. The man had just shifted his weight. "We'll get there," Lund said and stood. "Sit tight." He walked out. The door closed. Tessa sat very still in the chair, in the cold room, and breathed. The call came at 11:14 in the evening. Cassian Mora was in his penthouse on the 53rd floor of a building he owned outright, standing at the window that faced west, watching the city lights blur into the dark horizon. He had a glass of whiskey he hadn't drunk, and a report on his desk he had read 3 times without the words, settling anywhere useful. His phone rang. He answered it on the second ring. "We have a situation," said the voice of Ren Castillo, his head of operations, in the tone Ren used specifically for things that were going to require Cassian's personal attention. "Tell me." Lund moved on one of the Meridian employees tonight. Took her from the 14th floor after hours. She's at the Keller facility. Cassian set his glass down. "Which employee?" A pause. "Payroll. The accountant." "How?" Something that was not quite a feeling, more like the sudden sharpening of attention that precedes one, moved through him. He was quiet for 3 seconds, which anyone who knew him understood was a significant interval. "Why?" he said. "He thinks she's connected to the Hartwell discrepancy. Her codes were used in the reroute." "Were they?" "Ren," Cassian said. "Who was the last person to access Lund's terminal?" Silence. Then, "I need to check." "Check." He walked to his desk. He opened the security dashboard himself, the one that ran parallel to Meridian's official network, the one that Lund didn't know existed. He found what he was looking for in 40 seconds. Lund's own access card, Lund's own terminal, Lund's own credentials used to reroute the Hartwell accounts through a Delaware shell company 3 days ago, after which the same reroute had been attributed, very neatly, to a set of payroll access codes that would be very easy to blame on a quiet woman who had been doing her job carefully for 4 years and who was, Cassian now noted, not the sort of person anyone would rush to defend. He closed the laptop. He was already moving toward the door. "Get me a car," he said into the phone. "And Ren, make sure the team meets me there. Tell them to be quiet about it." "Should I tell them anything else?" "Tell them not to touch her." Tessa had been sitting in the chair for 3 hours when the door opened again, and it wasn't Lund. She heard the commotion before she saw it. Voices outside, some kind of disturbance, a sound she couldn't categorize immediately and then could, the particular flat percussion of a confrontation being ended rather than begun. Brief. Decisive. Then nothing. The door opened. The man who walked in was tall, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of contained stillness that didn't come from calm, but from absolute, practiced authority. He wore a charcoal coat over a shirt with no tie, and he stopped just inside the doorway and looked at her. Actually looked at her, the way people almost never did, and something crossed his face that she couldn't name. She had been in an elevator with Cassian Mora for 47 seconds, 14 months ago. She remembered his profile and his silence and the quality of space he occupied, which was somehow larger than the space he actually took up. She had not expected him to remember her. "Mr. Howe," he said. "Mr. Moore," she said, and was mildly proud of how steady her voice came out. He crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched down in front of her chair, which she had not anticipated. He was suddenly at her eye level, closer than she expected, and she could see the controlled anger in the set of his jaw. His eyes went to her cheek. They stayed there for a moment. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yes." "Are there other injuries?" She considered a half-truth and decided against it, because he was asking like a man who was going to be furious about the answer regardless, and lying would only make it worse. "My head, from when I went down. It's manageable." He didn't say anything. He stood, and he offered his hand, and she looked at it for a moment, the unexpected gesture of it, the formality, before she took it and stood. His hand was very warm. He didn't let go immediately. "You're going to want to look away," he said quietly. "I'm sorry?" He nodded toward the door for the next 30 seconds. "You'll want to look at the wall." She looked at the wall. She heard the sounds of Lund being removed from the facility, with the kind of efficiency that suggested extensive practice, and she kept her eyes on the water-stained concrete and breathed, and when Cassian said, "All right," she turned back around. "Come," he said, and walked ahead of her toward the door, and the 4 men who had been her guards for 3 hours parted around him like water. Around something harder. In the Qatar, she sat across from him in silence for 7 minutes, which she counted, because it was something to do with her mind. Then he said, "You found the discrepancy in the Hartwell accounts before it was supposed to be found. 3 weeks before?" "It was in the numbers," she said. "I wasn't looking for it." "You were never looking for any of it," he said. "And yet..." She didn't answer. "You've been correcting our books for 4 years, Miss Howe." Quietly, accurately, without flagging anything, which could be interpreted 2 ways. "I'm aware." "Which interpretation is correct?" She looked at the city moving past the window. The lights of Chicago in the early morning, the lake a dark expanse to the east, the structure and the cold beauty of it. She thought about what it would cost her to answer honestly, and she thought about what it might cost her not to. "I'm good at numbers," she said. "I'm good at seeing what's underneath them. I don't ask questions about things that aren't my job to ask about." She paused. "And I have a mother in a hospital in Naperville, and I needed to keep my job." He was quiet. "That's not an excuse," she said. "It's an explanation." "I know the difference," he said. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read entirely, but there was something in it that wasn't coldness. "The discrepancy you found. Lund created it to frame you. He's been skimming for 18 months. He needed someone to absorb the liability when it surfaced." Tessa looked at him. "You already knew I knew. Tonight, because of the codes." He paused. "Because of you." She thought about that. "He would have succeeded," she said. "If you hadn't." "He didn't, but he would have, if you hadn't come." She turned to look at him directly, which took more effort than she was accustomed to, looking directly at men who occupied the kind of power he did. "Why did you?" He held her gaze. "Because you've kept our books clean for 4 years and asked for nothing. Because someone in my organization put their hands on you. And because..." He stopped. Something moved across his face, brief and contained, before he reined it back in. "Because Lund made an error in judgment, and I correct errors." The car pulled up outside her building. She recognized it. The awning, the door, the potted tree that was always slightly worse for the winter, and she felt something in her chest unknot incrementally. She moved to open the door. He spoke. "Miss Howe." She stopped. "Do you have someone who can stay with you tonight?" She almost laughed. Not unkindly. It was just such an unexpected question from such a particular man. "I have a cat," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "That's not what I asked. I know." She lifted her chin a little. "I'll be fine, Mr. Moore. I've been managing on my own for a while." "I don't doubt it." He reached into the interior pocket of his coat and produced a card. Plain white, 1 phone number, no name. "If anything feels wrong tonight, if anyone approaches you, if anything is out of place, you call that number. Immediately." She took the card. The corner of it was warm from his pocket. "There will be someone outside your building tonight," he added. "Don't be alarmed. One of yours?" "Yes." She looked at the card. She looked at him. "Mr. Moore, why are you doing this?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at her the way he had in that cold warehouse room, with that same quality of actually seeing her, which she was still not accustomed to. "Because it was my organization that failed you," he said finally. "And I don't leave debts unpaid." She got out of the car. She stood on the sidewalk and watched it pull away into the Chicago dark, and she stood there for a moment, with the cold coming off the lake and the card in her hand, and her heart doing something erratic and inconvenient in her chest. Then she went upstairs. Her cat, a large and opinionated tabby named Clementine, was waiting on the mat inside the door with the specific expression of an animal who has opinions about the hour. Tessa picked her up and held her, and stood in the hallway of her apartment for a long time. She went back to work on Monday. She had spent the weekend expecting a call telling her not to, or alternately, a call telling her something much worse. Neither came. What came instead was a formal email from Meridian HR on Friday afternoon, informing her that Garrett Lund had been removed from his position, effective immediately, that a full audit of the Western distribution accounts was underway, and that her access credentials were being upgraded. Upgraded. She read that line 3 times. She went in on Monday wearing a dress she normally saved for Christmas parties. Deep wine red, fitted, with a belt that she usually talked herself out of, because it was a choice, small and private, to show up as herself rather than as the woman who was trying not to be seen. Clementine had knocked the dress off its hanger at 5 in the morning, which Tessa chose to interpret as approval. The 14th floor was different. She felt it before she could explain it. A shift in the quality of attention people paid her, the way eyes tracked to her when she stepped off the elevator. It wasn't the hostile appraisal she had sometimes felt before, the inventory and epist that she'd spent 4 years trying to preempt by being small and quiet and unremarkable. This was something else. Wariness may be calibration. She sat at her desk and opened her computer and got to work. He appeared in her doorway at 11:10. Not a surprise, exactly. The building had his energy in it, that particular electrical change in atmosphere that preceded him, but she looked up and found him there, and her fingers stilled on the keyboard. "Mrs. Howe," Cassian said, "do you have a moment?" "Of course," she said in the calm, flat voice, and then caught herself and said, a little differently, "Yes." He came in and closed the door. He didn't sit. He stood in front of her desk with his hands in his pockets, and he looked at her the same way he had looked at her twice now, and she thought, he is not a man who does anything accidentally. "The audit is going to take 6 weeks, he said. "During that time, you'll be working directly with my internal team. I'd like you to lead the reconciliation." She blinked. "Me? You know these accounts better than anyone else in this building, including the people who set them up." Something in his expression shifted, very slightly, possibly especially them. She paused. "That's a significant role." "Yes. You're certain you can trust me with it?" "I'm certain," he said, without hesitation and without performance, the way men said things they had already decided. She folded her hands on her desk. She thought about what she was going to say, and she said it anyway. "I want a raise." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, too restrained for that, but adjacent. "What percentage?" 22. "And a direct line to your legal team if anything comes up in the reconciliation that requires outside counsel." Done. She had expected negotiation. His immediate agreement threw her slightly, and she knew it showed on her face because he was watching her with that quality of attention that saw things. And she straightened and said, "All right then." "One more thing," he said. She waited. "Your access credentials were upgraded." He paused. "I should have done that 2 years ago. I apologize." She stared at him. In 4 years she had been overlooked, misfiled, underpaid, and ultimately abducted by one of his lieutenants. And now he was apologizing for an access level. "You're apologizing for the credentials," she said. "Among other things." He held her gaze. "I notice more than I act on, Miss Howe. That's a failure I intend to correct." The room was very quiet. The city went on outside the window, 48 floors below, indifferent and enormous. "Tessa," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "If we're going to work closely for 6 weeks," she said. "You can call me Tessa." Something changed in his face. Something that looked underneath the control and the authority and the careful distance he kept from everything, like relief. "Cassian," he said, 3 weeks into the reconciliation, at 7 in the evening, on a night when the rest of the team had gone home, and she and Cassian were the only ones left on the 14th floor. She found it. The original theft, not Lund's skimming, which was relatively straightforward. 3 million over 18 months, rerouted through the Delaware shells. Underneath it, older, more careful, the evidence of something that had been happening for almost a decade. A slow, methodical hemorrhage from a series of accounts that fed directly into the holding structure for 3 of Meridian's most protected assets. Her blood went cold. She looked at the numbers for a long time. She checked her methodology twice. She looked at the timestamps and the access logs. and the very deliberate, very patient pattern of it, and she understood that she had found something that was going to matter enormously, and that whoever had done this had been counting on nobody finding it. She printed the summary. She walked across the floor to the corner office, which was lit, and she knocked. "Come in." He was at his desk. He looked up when she entered, and something in her expression made him set down his pen. She put the summary in front of him. He read it. He was very still while he read. The particular stillness she had come to understand was not absence of reaction, but the complete management of it. She watched his face and saw nothing except the minute shift around his eyes when he reached the totals. He looked up. "How long did it take you to find this?" "Once I knew what to look for." 4 hours. She paused. "I think it's been here since the beginning. I think it was here before I was hired." He held her gaze. "Do you know who? I have a strong suspicion." She sat down across from him without being invited, because she was past the point of hovering in doorways. "The access pattern points to someone on your trust level, or close to it." Cassian was quiet. He looked at the summary again, and then he set it down and looked at her, and she could see the calculation behind his eyes. Not distrust, not suspicion of her, but the grinding work of a man revising his understanding of a decade of assumptions. "This," he said carefully, "is going to be complicated." "Yes," she said. "It is. You're not alarmed?" "I'm very alarmed," she said. "I'm just good at not showing it." She held his gaze. "I've had practice." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Have dinner with me." She blinked. "Now?" "It's 7:30 and neither of us has eaten since noon." He stood, reached for his coat. "And I think I'd like to talk to you somewhere that isn't a room full of evidence of a decade-long betrayal." She thought about it for exactly as long as it took her to decide she was done talking herself out of things. "Okay," she said, "but I want to change. I've been in this dress since 8 this morning. There's a car waiting downstairs. It can take you to your apartment first." She stood. She gathered her bag. She paused at the door and turned back, and she said, "The person who did this, you already know who it is, don't you?" He was buttoning his coat. He didn't answer immediately. "Cassian." "Yes," he said quietly. "I know, and—" He met her eyes. "And by morning, it will be handled." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and walked out, and he followed, and the lights of the 14th floor went dark behind them. She wore burgundy to dinner, because Clementine had knocked the burgundy dress onto the floor too, and at this point Tessa was reading it as instruction. She arrived at the restaurant, small, quiet, the kind of place where the staff knew exactly who the guests were and asked no questions, and found him already there. And he stood when she walked in, which she hadn't expected. They talked for 3 hours. Not about Meridian, not about the accounts or the audit or the decade-long hemorrhage in the books, or the man who had orchestrated it and whom Cassian would deal with in the particular way that men like Cassian dealt with things. They talked about everything else, about her mother, who was doing better, whose doctor had given a cautiously optimistic report last month. About Lion, which Cassian described with an economy that suggested he loved it more than he said. About numbers and what they told you about people, which turned out to be a subject that could sustain an entire dinner on its own. He listened to her. He listened the way very few people listened, without the slight restlessness of waiting to speak, without the half-attention of someone managing their own response. He just listened. Asked questions that showed he had been paying attention to the previous answer. Remembered the name of her cat unprompted. She laughed once, genuinely, about something he said, and she felt it. The way his eyes changed when she did, something in them going warm and focused, like a man watching something he had been looking for and not expected to find. Walking out, late, the November cold coming off the lake hard enough to sting, he put his hand at the small of her back, a gesture so unremarkable in its ease that she was several steps into the lobby before she registered it and felt her heart rate do something embarrassing. At the car, he said, "I owe you an apology." She tilted her head. "You mentioned that. Not for the credentials." He was very serious, standing in the cold with the city behind him. "For 4 years of not seeing you, clearly." He paused. "You were in plain sight and I looked through you, and I am genuinely sorry for that." She stood with the cold on her face and looked at him. This man who had handed her a phone number on a plain card and posted a guard outside her building and said, "I notice more than I act on," like it was a confession. "You see me now," she said. "Yes," he said, simply. "Absolutely. I do." The car was warm. He got in beside her, and the city moved past the windows, and she turned and looked at him in the dark interior and said, "For what it's worth, I saw you too. From the beginning." Something moved through his expression. He turned to look at her. "What did you see?" She thought about it. She thought about the quality of stillness he carried, and the way he moved through rooms, and the 47 seconds in the elevator, when he had stood beside her, and she had understood, instinctively and without wanting to, that this was a man of total conviction, that whatever he decided completely. "Someone who keeps his word," she said, "even when it costs him." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, very carefully, like a man disassembling a habit he had practiced for a long time, the distance in his expression let go. "Tessa," he said. "Yes, I'm going to need you to stay." She knew he wasn't talking about the job. She looked at him for a moment, the city lights sliding across his face, the earnestness underneath the control, the way he was asking rather than assuming, which was not what she would have expected from a man like him, and which was maybe the most important thing she had learned about him in 3 weeks of watching him work. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Outside, Chicago stretched to the horizon in every direction, enormous, indifferent, blazing. In the morning there would be a reconciliation to finish, and a betrayal to answer for, and the long, careful work of building something on ground that had been cleared of lies. There would be numbers and evidence, and the very complicated business of what came next. But for now it was just the car, and the dark, and the man beside her, who had looked at her and actually seen her, and who had said, "I notice more than I act on," and meant it as an apology and a promise in the same breath. Clementine was going to have opinions about all of this, Tessa thought. She was looking forward to explaining it.